She was abandoned in the cold void of space, thrown away like garbage, no name, no future, but fate had other plans. Rescued by a lone scavenger, she awakens with a power that could change the galaxy. What happens when a broken girl rises to become more than anyone ever imagined? Stay tuned, because her story is just beginning. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and give the video a thumbs up. Now let's jump into the story. In the vast emptiness of space, a slave transport ship drifted aimlessly, far above a barren and forgotten moon. The stars were silent, distant, and uncaring, as if the universe itself had chosen to ignore the suffering of those aboard the ship. Inside, the air was thick with the harsh echoes of heavy boots stomping against the cold, metallic floors. The sharp cries of the broken and the weak reverberated through the dim corridors, but none of them reached the ears of those who held the power to stop it. In a dark corner of the ship, chained and forgotten, lay a young alien girl, her silver skin bruised and battered, her once pristine white hair tangled and matted with blood and grime. Her eyes, a brilliant shade of purple, no longer held the spark of hope. They had long since turned hollow, devoid of any belief that things could ever be different. She was called Unit 3199, a name given by the cruel captors who saw her not as a person, but as an object, a tool for trade, one they had deemed worthless. To the slavers, she was nothing more than a fragile, sickly creature. She was small and weak, and they had no use for her. For months, she had been forced to clean up the blood that stained the ship's floors, scrubbing away the evidence of violence and death, yet never once speaking a word or fighting back. She had learned long ago that resistance was futile. It was easier to remain silent, to endure the endless torment, than to hope for something better. It was easier to be invisible, to blend into the shadows of the ship, than to stand up and risk facing the wrath of the men who controlled her fate. But today, as she lay chained to the cold floor, too weak to even sit up, the last shred of hope she once held had finally withered away. The ship's guards walked past her without a glance, their boots clanging loudly in the sterile metal hallways. One of them stopped suddenly, a low growl escaping his lips. He kicked the girl hard in the ribs, the impact leaving her gasping for air. "She's no good," the guard muttered under his breath, his voice thick with disdain. "She's nothing but dead weight. No one's gonna buy this garbage." The captain, who had been standing nearby, didn't even bother to look at her. He barely even acknowledged the guard's words. "Throw her off," the captain ordered, his voice cold and indifferent. "We don't feed the dead weight." The guard grinned, a cruel, twisted smile spreading across his face. He grabbed the girl by the collar and roughly yanked her to her feet. The chains that bound her clinked and rattled as he dragged her down the hallway. She didn't fight him. She didn't scream or beg for mercy. She was too weak, too tired to do anything but let him pull her along like a discarded object. When they reached the airlock, the guard didn't even hesitate. He pressed a button, and the heavy doors slid open with a hiss. The cold void of space stretched out before them, an endless abyss that would swallow her whole. No one said goodbye. No one cared. With a quick, careless motion, the guard pushed the girl into the airlock, her frail body tumbling out into the infinite darkness. She was thrown into space as if she were no more important than a piece of trash. Her body twisted and spun in the vacuum, weightless, with nothing to stop her from being lost forever in the cold expanse of the universe. The doors closed behind her, cutting off any trace of her existence aboard the ship. And just like that, she was gone, discarded and forgotten. But fate had other plans. Far below the ship, on the surface of the quiet moon, a lone scavenger named Marcus Thorne was going about his usual routine. He had lived on the moon for years, collecting scraps from wrecked ships and broken droids. The isolation didn't bother him. He preferred the silence. In the vast emptiness, he could focus on his work without distraction. But that day, something was different. As Marcus made his way across the desolate landscape, a sudden loud boom echoed through the air, shaking the ground beneath his feet. It sounded like something had crashed nearby. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for ships to crash on the barren surface, but this was something bigger, something he hadn't heard before. Curious, Marcus jumped into his desert crawler and sped toward the source of the explosion. As he approached, a trail of smoke rose into the sky, marking the crash site. But when he reached the crater, he was stunned by what he saw. It wasn't a ship that had crashed. It was a body small and fragile, lying motionless in the dust. The figure was barely breathing, but the faint rise and fall of her chest told him she was still alive. He slammed the door and jumped out of the crawler, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he rushed toward her. She wasn't human. Her skin was a shimmering silver, and her hair was a wild mess of white. She had shackles around her wrists, faded and broken, as if they had been torn away from her in some desperate escape. Her face was pale, streaked with blood, and her eyes were shut tight. Marcus knelt beside her, his heart racing. "Hey," he whispered gently, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Are you alive?" There was no answer, only the faint sound of shallow breathing. His hand hovered above her, unsure of how to help. He gently touched her shoulder, but she flinched at the touch, her body trembling as though she feared more pain. Marcus' heart sank. She had been hurt so much, both physically and emotionally, but he wasn't going to hurt her. He carefully picked her up, cradling her light, fragile body in his arms. She was too small, too weak, and it was clear that she hadn't eaten in days, maybe longer. But as he carried her back to his shelter, he promised himself that he would do everything he could to help her survive. Little did Marcus know, this fragile girl, abandoned and left to die, would soon become the key to unlocking a story far larger than either of them could ever imagine. The wind howled across the barren moon, kicking up swirling dust clouds that danced through the desolate landscape. The silence of the planet was broken only by the sound of Marcus Thorne's desert crawler as it rumbled across the cracked, dry earth. A scavenger by trade, Marcus had lived alone on this forgotten moon for years, gathering old tech from wrecked ships and discarded machinery. It was a lonely existence, but one that suited him just fine. The solitude allowed him to focus on his work without interruption. There was something peaceful about the emptiness, as if the universe itself had forgotten this place. But today, the silence was shattered by a sudden deafening explosion that echoed through the still air, rattling the ground beneath Marcus's feet. He slammed on the brakes of his crawler, his heart racing. The explosion had come from somewhere close by, sending a plume of smoke rising into the sky. He could feel the thrum of curiosity pulse through him. A crash meant wreckage, and wreckage meant salvage, something Marcus had always managed to turn into a decent find, but this felt different. This was no ordinary crash. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of where it had come from. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cracked surface of the moon, but the trail of smoke was easy to spot. He didn't hesitate. With one final glance over his shoulder, he hit the throttle and sped off toward the crash site. The terrain was rough, the crawler bouncing as it barreled over rocks and uneven ground. The closer he got, the more the air around him seemed to hum with tension. Something had gone wrong. This wasn't just another ordinary piece of junk fallen from the sky. No, this was something far more significant. As he neared the crater where the explosion had originated, he slowed the crawler down, careful not to damage it. His eyes scanned the area, taking in the wreckage strewn across the ground. But it wasn't a ship that had fallen. It was something else entirely. In the center of the crater, half buried in the dust, lay a small figure. A body. A girl. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He jumped out of the crawler, his boots crunching against the dry soil as he rushed toward her. At first, he thought she was dead. She was so still, so pale, with nothing but the faintest rise and fall of her chest, indicating she was still alive. Her silver-toned skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, a stark contrast to the dark, lifeless terrain surrounding her. Her hair, long and white, was matted with blood and dirt, tangled in knots that looked like they had never been untangled. She was covered in bruises, and her body was so thin it looked as though she hadn't eaten in weeks, if not longer. For a moment, Marcus simply stood there, staring at her, unsure of what to do. His mind raced, taking in the details. She wasn't human. He had seen enough life forms in his years of scavenging to know that much. Her appearance was unlike anything he had ever encountered. She was small, fragile, and clearly injured, but there was something else, something that hinted at a strength beneath the surface. But the girl's condition was critical. She needed help, and fast. Without thinking twice, Marcus knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he checked for a pulse. It was faint but steady. A wave of relief washed over him. She was alive. He could save her. Gently, he reached out, lifting her frail body into his arms. She weighed nothing, like a bundle of sticks. Her body was cold, and her skin felt as though it had been exposed to the harsh elements for far too long. Marcus winced at the feeling but held on, determined to get her back to his shelter. The journey back to his small metal home was a blur. His mind focused entirely on the girl in his arms. Who was she? How had she ended up here, lying half dead in the dirt of a forgotten moon? There was no time to answer those questions now. All that mattered was getting her inside, getting her warm, and giving her whatever care she needed to survive. The shelter was only a few miles away, but it felt like an eternity as Marcus drove the crawler over the rocky terrain. When they finally reached the shelter, Marcus rushed inside, laying the girl down gently on the cot. His heart pounded in his chest as he worked quickly to assess her injuries. Her wrists were bruised, the faint remnants of shackles still visible around her skin. She had clearly been in captivity, a prisoner of some kind. But who would keep someone like her in chains? The thought made Marcus's stomach turn. He didn't want to think about it for too long. She was here now. She was safe for the moment, at least. He moved around the shelter with practiced efficiency, grabbing medical supplies and blankets. The girl remained unconscious, her body barely reacting to the care he gave her. He cleaned her wounds, covered her with a warm blanket, and left some water and soft food nearby, hoping that she might regain some strength when she woke. But she didn't stir. She didn't move. It was as if the weight of her past had crushed her so thoroughly that even the simplest act of kindness couldn't reach her. Marcus stood back and looked at her for a long time, feeling a strange sense of responsibility settle in his chest. He had no idea who she was or where she had come from, but one thing was clear: she needed him. He had saved her life, but there was no telling if she would survive the night. His mind drifted back to the wreckage outside. It hadn't been a normal crash. There was something strange about the way the girl had fallen, something that didn't sit right with him, but for now, none of that mattered. He had done what he could. The rest, he told himself, would come in time. The night stretched on, and Marcus sat at his workbench waiting. He glanced over at the girl every so often, hoping for a sign, a flicker of life in her once bright eyes. But there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind outside, and the soft ticking of his old machines. It wasn't until the morning came that Marcus finally got the answer he'd been waiting for. It wasn't much, just the faintest sound, a soft shuffle. He turned and saw her still weak, but alive. Her eyes flickered open, glowing with fear, her breath shallow as she took in her surroundings. It was a start, and for Marcus, that was all that mattered. It meant she had a chance to live. The days that followed were slow and quiet. Marcus spent most of his time working on old machines, tinkering with tools, and maintaining his shelter. But his thoughts were never far from the girl he had found in the crater. He had done what he could to keep her alive, but now it was up to her. He wasn't sure if she would ever fully recover, or if she would even wake up. Her condition was worse than he'd originally thought. Her body had been starved, abused, and left to die in the harsh cold of space. But she was still breathing, and that was a sign that there was hope. For the first few days, she remained in a deep, unresponsive sleep. Marcus didn't push her to wake up. He just let her rest, keeping a watchful eye on her while continuing his work. His heart ached every time he looked at her. She looked so small, so fragile. He wondered what kind of life she had lived before, what horrors she had endured. But he couldn't dwell on those thoughts for too long. She was here now, and that was all that mattered. The rest would come in time. One evening, as Marcus was working on a broken drone near the corner of his shelter, he heard a small noise behind him. He turned quickly, his eyes searching the dimly lit room. There, sitting on the edge of the cot, was the girl. Her purple eyes were wide with fear, and her body was trembling, but she was awake. She had pushed herself up, despite the weakness that still clung to her. It was the first time he had seen her move since he had brought her inside. Marcus's heart lifted slightly at the sight of her, though he could see that she was still scared, still unsure of her surroundings. "Hey," Marcus said softly, lowering his tools and taking a cautious step toward her. "You're awake." The girl didn't answer, but her eyes darted around the room, scanning the unfamiliar space. Her breathing was fast and shallow, and she looked as if she were ready to flee at any moment. Her hands clutched at the blanket wrapped around her, her knuckles white with tension. She was clearly frightened, and Marcus could see that she didn't trust him yet. It made sense. He was a stranger, and she had been hurt by strangers before. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcus said gently, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." The girl didn't speak, but her eyes met his for the first time. She didn't flinch, though there was still a tremor of fear in her gaze. Slowly, she looked down at her hands, where the shackles had been, and Marcus followed her gaze. The remnants of the restraints were still visible, faint scars on her thin wrists. They were a reminder of everything she had been through. Marcus couldn't help the wave of anger that rose within him. Whoever had done this to her, whoever had treated her like an object, like nothing more than a piece of property. They had a price to pay. But Marcus pushed those thoughts aside. This girl was here now, and he was going to help her, no matter what. Over the next few days, Marcus continued to care for her. He fed her small bits of food, hoping she would regain her strength, but she still didn't speak. She only watched him with those wide, cautious eyes. Sometimes when he would leave food near her, she would wait until he wasn't looking before she would sneak small bites, as if she feared that it might be poisoned. Marcus noticed, but he didn't say anything. He understood. Trust wasn't something that could be given freely. It had to be earned, one small act at a time. In the evenings, Marcus would sit at his workbench, fixing machines or tinkering with old parts, and he would glance over at the girl. She would be sitting in the corner of the room, her eyes never leaving him. She seemed to study him, as though trying to figure him out. He didn't mind. He was patient. He didn't push her. He just let her watch him, let her take things at her own pace. It wasn't until the third night, when Marcus had set a bowl of warm soup beside her cot, that he noticed something different. He had placed it there without a word, just as he had done before, and then gone back to his work. But when he turned around, he saw her slowly, cautiously reaching out for the bowl. Her fingers hovered above it for a moment, as if she were unsure, but then she grabbed it, pulling it close to her chest as though it were a precious treasure. She sniffed it first, then dipped one finger into the soup. When she tasted it, she hesitated, and for a moment, Marcus thought she might push it away. But instead, she began to eat slowly, carefully, as if she feared the food might be taken away at any moment. Marcus didn't react. He let her eat in peace, knowing that this small act, this simple act of accepting food, was a sign of progress. It was the first real sign that she was starting to trust him, even if just a little. That night, for the first time, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. She was no longer the broken, silent figure she had been when he first found her. She was beginning to come back to life. The following morning, when Marcus woke up, he found her sitting by the door, staring out at the horizon. The blanket wrapped around her body like armor, her knees hugged to her chest as she gazed at the red sunrise. Marcus stood quietly for a moment, watching her. There was something in the way she looked at the sky, something that told him she had a past, a history, that went far beyond the wreckage of her life. He approached her slowly, careful not to startle her. "You like the sky?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle. The girl didn't turn to him, but after a long moment, she pointed to the horizon. Her finger traced the line where the sun met the sand. And for the first time, her lips moved, though the words were barely a whisper. "Home," she said. Her voice cracked and dry. Marcus's heart ached at the sound of that word. Home. It was clear that she had lost something, maybe everything, and now she was looking for it again. Slowly, Marcus set up a portable hollow screen and began showing her simple words with pictures. "Water," he said, pointing to the image of a flowing river. "Food," he continued, holding up the bowl. He paused, then pointed to himself, saying his name, Marcus. The girl stared at the screen, and then, almost too quiet to hear, she whispered, "Siri." Marcus froze. The name was foreign, ancient somehow, and it felt important. But there was no way of knowing for sure. She hadn't spoken much, but the way she said it, there was a depth to it, a connection to something long forgotten. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he felt it. Her name was Siri, and somehow, that felt like the beginning of something much bigger. As the days passed, their lives started to settle into a routine. Marcus worked on his machines, and Siri slowly began to open up. She didn't speak much, but she didn't hide anymore either. She watched Marcus as he worked, and occasionally she would ask for something: water, food, a blanket, and when he provided it, she would thank him, quietly but sincerely. Each small step was a victory. And as she began to trust him, Marcus began to trust her too. There was something about her, a quiet strength, an untapped power that he couldn't explain. He didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but he knew one thing: she wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor. And he would help her find her way, no matter where it led. The days seemed to stretch on endlessly in the small shelter, the quiet of the moon broken only by the hum of old machines and the soft rustling of wind outside. Marcus had gotten used to the steady rhythm of life with Siri. She had come a long way since the first time he had found her in the crater, weak and broken. Now she was stronger, more alert. She still didn't speak much, but the fear in her eyes had started to fade. She moved around the shelter more, eating a bit more, even making small attempts at communication. But there was something else, something deeper that Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on. There were moments, brief flashes, when he saw something in her, a flicker of power, something unnatural. But he pushed it aside, unsure whether it was just his imagination or something else. Then, one night, everything changed. Marcus had been outside working on the old communication panel, trying to salvage some parts to fix the broken drone. The storm had rolled in, dark clouds swirling across the sky, and the air inside the shelter was thick with the smell of dust and ozone. It was a quiet night, the kind where everything seemed still, almost unnaturally so. But that silence was shattered when Marcus heard a loud, piercing scream from inside the shelter. His heart leapt into his throat. He dropped his tools and ran inside, fear flooding his chest. There, in the center of the room, stood Siri, her hands pressed to her head, her body trembling violently. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth moving but no words coming out. She was holding her head, her body shaking like she was trying to fight off some unseen force. Marcus rushed toward her, but before he could reach her, a flash of light shot out from her hands. A burst of raw energy that seemed to pulse from her skin like a flame. The force of it knocked Marcus back, sending him crashing into a pile of scrap metal. For a moment, everything went still. The storm outside howled louder than ever, but inside, there was only silence. Marcus struggled to push himself up, his heart racing, his mind trying to process what had just happened. What had that been? Was she ... He looked at Siri, still standing in the center of the room, her hands glowing faintly with a strange, unearthly light. Her eyes were wide with shock, and she looked just as confused as Marcus felt. She was breathing hard, as though she had just run a race, and her whole body was tense with fear. But it was the light, no, the power that had stunned him. He had never seen anything like it before. "Siri?" Marcus called softly, his voice cautious but filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Siri didn't answer at first. Her hands dropped to her sides, the glow slowly fading from her skin. She took a deep, shuddering breath, but her body was still shaking. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. She opened her mouth, but her voice caught in her throat. The words wouldn't come. "It's okay," Marcus said, taking a careful step forward. "You're safe." But Siri didn't seem to hear him. She backed away slowly, as though she was afraid that if she moved too quickly, something worse might happen. She reached for her head, again, as though trying to hold herself together, and that's when Marcus saw it, the deep pain in her eyes, the anguish that seemed to come from a place far beyond anything he could understand. She wasn't just scared of what was happening to her. She was terrified of herself. "I didn't mean to," Siri whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to do that." Marcus's heart sank. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what had happened, but he knew that it wasn't something she had planned. It had been an accident, something she couldn't control. He moved closer, cautiously, keeping his voice gentle. "You didn't hurt anyone. It's okay." Siri shook her head, her eyes starting to well up with tears. I don't know what's happening to me." Marcus felt a rush of empathy. He had no answers for her, no explanation for the strange power she had just unleashed. All he could do was offer her the comfort that she wasn't alone. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." The following days were filled with a new kind of tension. Siri's abilities, whatever they were, seemed to be growing stronger. It wasn't just a one-time accident anymore. She began to notice the power building inside her, surging and pulsing like an electric current just beneath her skin. It scared her, and Marcus could see it. She had always been afraid of the past, afraid of the people who had hurt her, afraid of being left alone again. But now she was afraid of herself. Marcus knew that this fear was different. It wasn't just the fear of a girl who had been abandoned and abused. It was the fear of someone who had a power they didn't understand, a power that could destroy everything if left unchecked. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. He could see something in her, something he hadn't fully realized before. Siri wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just the broken girl he had found in the crater. She was stronger than that, and he would help her find a way to control this power, to understand it. Every day, they worked together. Marcus would set up simple exercises, teaching her to focus, to calm herself. At first, it was chaotic. Her energy would flare out uncontrollably, knocking over objects, leaving scorch marks on the walls. But slowly, gradually, she began to gain control. Her movements became more precise, her focus sharper. With each day, she grew stronger, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And then, one afternoon, as Marcus watched her focus on a piece of scrap metal, something remarkable happened. The energy that had once exploded from her hands now emanated slowly, controlled and steady. She raised her hand, and the metal before her began to glow faintly, then bend, shifting into the shape she desired. It was a simple act, but for both of them, it was a breakthrough. Siri looked up at Marcus, her eyes wide with astonishment. "I did it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus smiled, a feeling of pride swelling in his chest. "You did." It was then that he realized Siri wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live again. And with her newfound power, she wasn't just a survivor. She was becoming something more, a force to be reckoned with. The world had forgotten her once, but it wouldn't forget her again. The storm had passed, but the winds outside still howled, carrying with them the promise of something greater. For the first time, Marcus could see the future clearly, one where Siri would stand tall, unafraid of the power within her. And he would be there to help her every step of the way.